Hello YouTube, my name is Marie, and here on my channel I post K-drama related videos. 90% of the time that means I'm posting a first impression or full series review of a currently or past aired K-drama, but today we are going to do something very different. The only other video that is somewhat like this that I've done at all is this one here, where I did a K-drama fan commentary on the cancellation of a show and kind of the drama that was surrounding that. Today though, I'm not doing a commentary, I'm doing a response video to a comment that I received several months ago at this point under my Mr. Okay, so that was a slip of the tongue, and I don't know how many more times I'm going to make that slip up throughout this video, but I am not talking about my Mr. I'm talking about Mr. Sunshine. I don't know what happened. When I first received this comment, it really stuck out to me because when I first read it, the author of the comment uses a lot of language that if you don't know any better as the reader, then you would just assume that they're correct, when in fact they're wrong on almost every account. Instead of just, like deleting that comment, which I don't usually delete comments unless they're mean or nasty, that comment still exists over on my Mr. First Impression review video, I want to respond here. So before we go any farther, it will be very useful for you to know what my Mr. is actually about, or kind of the broad scope of the setting, because we're not going to actually be talking about the drama and the historical accuracies of the drama itself, because that's a whole other discussion and I don't really want to dip my toe into that controversy. My Mr. is a historical drama that is set in the late 19th, early 20th century South Korea. Then it was known as Choson. I don't remember if the series gives an exact date for when our main character, his name is Eugene, when he comes back to his homeland of Choson, but in the wiki synopsis they mention he was a child during 1871, and then I believe he's around 30 when he comes back. So we are looking at the early 20th century. But the most important benchmark here is the fact that this series begins, and the vast majority of it, I actually haven't finished the series, but the vast majority of it takes place prior to the Japanese occupation or annexing of the country, which happened in 1910. This is a really important date and we're going to get back to it. So now that we have the time frame in mind, I'm going to read you the quote or the comment, and I'm going to read you the full thing so you get the full context of what A is saying, and we're just going to refer to this person as A. It was better for people of Joseon to have Japanese rule, because almost half of the population was slaves who could legally be killed at the whim of the Yangbans. That is why it is a historical fact that most of the Korean anti-Japanese fighters consisted of Yangbans. They resisted Japanese not because they loved their country, but to maintain status quo, to maintain their privileges. But to the lower classes, which was the majority of Koreans, Japanese rule brought real liberation from slavery. That is why in 1910, when Japan formalized their control of Korea, there was no massive protest or resistance by the majority of Koreans. To most Koreans, Japanese rule brought real change in the form of emancipation from slavery. Also, Japan did not only regard Choson as a colony, rather it considered Choson as one of its provinces. Most modern-day Koreans will not really admit it, but it is true that Japanese rule brought positive change to the non-ruling class of Korea. It was much better for them than the Joseon dynasty. Wow, there's a lot to unpack here. Like a lot. I've been reading this thing for months now and trying to collect my thoughts. I have been able to break down A's comment into what I think are 3 main points. The first one being Choson was a slave society and Japanese rule brought real change in the form of emancipation from that slavery. Number 2, Japanese resistance came from Yangbans, who were trying to maintain their privilege and their rights over the commoner class, and that is why in 1910 you do not see a lot of mass protests from the commoner class. Lastly, Japan regarded Choson as one of its own provinces, bringing about positive changes. I will not be able to talk about all 3 of these points in this video. I'm only going to talk about number 1, and that is because number 2, if you really think about it and try and outline a response as I have, really to adequately rebuttal this point, you have to trace the development of modern Korean nationalism. And surprising, it's actually a new phenomenon, or relatively new for a country that claims to have 5,000 years of history. So that is one reason we're not going to talk about number 2 today, and we're also not going to talk about number 3 because it's a very complex issue and you cannot say in a blanket statement whether or not Japanese imperialism was good or bad for Korean people, because yes, on one hand, it helped modernize a country that did not have the funds to do so on its own at that time. But on the other hand, did it lower Koreans to second-class citizens who were barred from practicing a lot of cultural traditions? Yes, so both of these things are true, and you need to discuss them both. If you guys want to see further discussions on 2 and 3, you gotta make sure to like and comment on this video. I need to know that my effort is worth it and you guys will enjoy more of these discussions. And one little disclaimer before we go any farther, I want to kind of introduce myself and where I'm getting my knowledge from. Basically, why I think you shouldn't just disregard everything I say. So first of all, I am an Asian Area Studies major at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. I've also applied to add a Korean language and culture minor to that degree. Asian Area Studies is like a huge umbrella. So for me personally, I have focused my studies on East Asia, mainly China, Japan, and Korea. Every major claim that I make in this video will have a kind of an in-text, but like through video, so in-video citation, which is gonna look something like this. Just so if you're not familiar with academic citations, it's gonna have the author's last name of a paper, the year that paper was published, and the page number. There is a one citation that I mentioned that does not have a year, and that is because I was able to read it when my professor uploaded it. It was written by my professor, Donald Baker, fantastic professor. So that will just simply have Baker and then the page number, and then you can go into the description of this video and you'll be able to find like Baker, then the full title of the document that I read and the page number of it. That's like a one-off. Every other citation will have a year number, and you should be able to look them up at your local library. Whether or not you have access to them to be able to read them yourself, that's another story, and I don't know, because a lot of these papers you have to pay to be able to read them. I have access to them through my tuition fees. And I am not an expert on history by any means. People have dedicated their entire careers to studying this period of Korean history, so do fact check me, or if you think I missed something really important to mention, leave it below and your source. I would love to expand my own knowledge through you guys. A's first point. I can disprove this in one sentence alone. It's very easy, actually. A quick Google search and you could also find your answer. But wait till the end, because I'm going to use this as an opportunity to introduce to my brand new green viewers of K-dramas and Korean history what the Korean slave history landscape looked like. That is what this video really is. Part 1 ongoing academic debate. So a discussion of the Korean slave is not complete unless I recognize the ongoing issue and conflict with the translation of the term. In North America, such as my professors and most of the papers that I will cite, we translate the term nobi, written like this in Hangul, as slave. But on the other hand, a lot of people have argued that serf or servant is more accurate. There is considerable debate as to whether the Korean nobi system constituted slavery, serfdom, or both. Scholarly consensus is that nobi was a slave until at least the Koro dynasty. However, there is debate as to changes in peasant and nobi status under the Choson dynasty, with the development of a land property system that altered the relationship between the dominant and subordinate classes. And then if you read a little farther into this article, a lot of people who claim that the nobi should be translated as a serf are really coming from the Marxist perspective. This is a fantastic article if you are at all interested on reading more about nobi. I was introduced to this debate several years ago, even before I started pursuing the Asian Studies degree, with a comment that simply read, under the same video, that simply read, not slave, maybe a servant. If you were born servant, you were always a servant. So this kind of debate on whether or not a nobi should be translated as slave or servant is not relegated only to an academic setting. Personally, I am of the opinion if you can own, sell, or inherit a human being, that constitutes a slave status, regardless of the very unique characteristics that this person also may have. So for the rest of this video, I will be referring to nobi as slaves. Part 2, unique characteristics of nobi. So now we're getting into like the nitty-gritty of why this debate even exists, and that is because Korean slaves are very unique. Nobi were not ethnically different from their masters. Also, nobi did not receive egregious mistreatment. I'm not saying that no nobi ever received mistreatment or was abused. Of course, there was probably circumstances, but in general, and through every paper that I have read so far, nobi did not experience this. In fact, nobi had significantly more agency than other slaves. Although it's not widely common, nobi could own their own property, and they could also appear in court on behalf of their masters. So you see just by that example that nobi's words or voice had a legal standing. Now, the height of slavery in Korea was definitely the 17th century. During this time, slaves within the broader population of Koreans represented 3/4 of the population. That's crazy. That is what you would categorize as a slave society. These numbers, these huge numbers, indicate that slave labor was incredibly important. In fact, at this time, slaves were considered to be the hands and feet of the noble privileged class. So where could a nobi exist? Well, they had two different sectors. They had the public and the private sector. Within the public sector, slaves served both palace and government officials. They performed a wide variety of duties, from daily chores to acting as personal retainers for these officials. If you ever watch historical kdramas and the eunuchs who are running around, those are all technically slaves. Whereas private slaves could work directly in their master's home or live as farmers who pay tribute. Part 3, the decline of the nobi. So the 17th century, specifically 1663, this is the very height of slave percentage of the population within Korean history. But after that, it does decline. In general, between the 11th and the 18th century, 30% of the population were slaves. Now this is still a really high number, but you can see that it is lower than the 17th century. This 30% number falls drastically within just a century. So by the 19th century, only 1.5% of the population were slaves. So little compared to 30%. Now, why this huge decline in nobi status happened? Well, that has to do with a lot of economic and also social class reasons. The later part of the Joseon dynasty saw a lot of shifting of social class lines. New subclasses emerged altogether, such as like the secondary sons of the Yangban, who were illegitimate children of the Yangban, formed their own class who intermarried, had very specific rules and roles and all that stuff. So they're a really interesting group on their own. Another thing that happened was the growth of the small independent farmer class. Also during the Joseon dynasty, people stopped calculating their wealth based on how many nobi they had. Instead, wealth was calculated based on land. Later in Joseon, it became way cheaper to simply pay for the goods that you needed from someone independent than it was to raise, to feed, to clothe, to house, to medicate if your slave got sick. Like you just see here that it's not a practical economic reason anymore. There's no reason to keep slaves. There is also a very interesting moral component at play as well. So we're gonna go off on a bit of a tangent, but I promise you it does circle back to nobi. Joseon was a Confucianist society, and they had a Confucianist government. And as a Confucianist government, they strongly believed that the best person should be given the job, essentially. And how you proved if you were the best person for the job was you had to sit the civil service exam. This is something that was imported from China. However, unlike China, Joseon restricted the access to the civil service exam to only those of Yangban status. Now remember, there were Yangban and then the illegitimate children of Yangban, who are known as the Tonggin. I'll put the name somewhere there. Their children were not allowed to take the civil service exam. And the argument became that there could be a great man of talent who would be very beneficial to a government position, born as an illegitimate child, and as such were stunting men of talent, a detriment to society as a whole, by barring them from taking the civil service exam and getting those positions. There were several petitions calling for this policy to be changed. Petitioners argued that the current law stunted talented men, as I said, led to unfair appointments and destroyed the father-son relationship, which are all unjustifiable consequences according to neo-Confucianist philosophies touted at that time. All of these arguments were also applied to nobi. What if a great man of learning or of intelligence was born a slave? What do you do then in a society that believes in merit-based appointments? So now let's jump to 1801. 66,000 official slaves released. Although that moral debate existed and was quite heated at times, the main reason why these slaves were released unfortunately was not moral. It was more economic, like we've already discussed. But I think it's really important when talking about the standing of a slave in Joseon society to talk about the fact that Joseon elites themselves, because the people that were having this discussion were the Yangbans, were the Tonggin. Oh, why is that so hard for me? Already that is disproving some of A's argument. Then about 80 years later, in 1886, hereditary slaves were legally abolished. Part 4, why A is wrong. Let's take one more look at A's main argument, the first one that we're discussing in this video. Joseon was a slave society, and Japanese rule brought real change in the form of emancipation from slavery. So the first part, Chosun was a slave society. False. As I've just proved to you, the later years of Chosun saw a massive decrease in the proportion of the population who were slaves, only 1.5% compared to, say, in the 17th century when it was 3/4 of the population. So it's just not true by the end of Chosun when the Japanese were really getting involved. Chosun cannot be considered a slave society. Japanese rule freed the slaves. This is also just false. All forms of slavery were abolished in 1894. 1894. 16 years before Japan annexed the country. You're just plain wrong if you think that Japan emancipated the Korean slaves. You're just wrong because they were already freed. They were already free. You can make the argument that social attitudes and discrimination still existed. Of course it did. Change takes a lot of time. And so if it was known that your family was nobi, sure, for sure there was probably discrimination that you faced. But again, to make that argument that Japan is this hero to Korean slaves is it's just wrong. So you guys, that is everything for today's video. I have been talking for a long time. This is probably the longest video in a while that I've made. So if you want part 2 and 3 where I go over the rest of A's arguments, you really have to help me out. You have to be engaged below. Again, all of my references are listed below, and I hope you have a good day and a good night. Bye.